Before you on the screen, you see a real Yemen voting ballot from a few years ago. This is the candidate Hadi, H-A-D-I, I believe is spelled, who was running for the president of Yemen. Now, the civil war in Yemen has ensued since this point, with involvement from Saudi Arabia, aided and abetted with money and resources and assistance from the United States, fighting with and for Al-Qaeda against the Houthis in Yemen. And it is at the point now of being the greatest humanitarian crisis on the planet today, with starvation, cholera, death of many young children. But for all this, as these tensions were heating up, this was the voting ballot. And in case you don't see what you're supposed to do with this particular voting ballot, this is your option. You have one candidate and you check the box, or you draw something in there, or you do an X, whatever. And I had a student a few years ago who thought they could be clever, saying, well, I would just throw the voting ballot away. Oh, that means you didn't vote. Now, what would you do if this was your only voting option? Would you still participate in voting? I voted for people who weren't on the ballot, who I knew weren't going to win, as a matter of principle, philosophy, and conscience. But maybe I was doing something irrational. Maybe I had the ability to do that without, of course, having these type of results that they've had in Yemen. The cost for me to do that is not as high. But this is the voting ballot. It gives an air of legitimacy. And so even though that places may have voting, does not necessarily mean that the people have consented to the government just because they have participated in the act of voting. Because voting doesn't communicate that. As we'll see, voting doesn't communicate what people think it does oftentimes. Keep in mind as well that in a democracy, not just like in Yemen, but votes count the same. No matter if someone studied for 18 hours on the topics and the candidates, or if someone voted and pulled the lever with their eyes closed. And smart people can disagree, but the reality is all these votes are the same, and we vote secretly. I mean, which has its good aspects to it, but this also means that I can vote for horrible things to be happening to my neighbor, outsource the force to the government so that I don't feel bad when it happens, and then my neighbor never knows. And there's no chance to hold me accountable. I had the right to vote in secret. And so voting may not reflect consent to the government. And so let's look at this concept a bit further. Here's a common statement. If people vote and participate in a government process, it means that they have consented to the government and its results. And it sounds reasonable. I get that people vote and they expect they have input. They don't always win, but they feel like that they have input and can move toward changing their political environment. People in power bad, they can vote them out, and they do. That does happen. That there's outputs from their inputs, that if they can talk and argue and peacefully convince people, that they can affect change. I understand the argument behind voting. I really do. But it's not a guarantee that people have consented to a government. Here's some reasons why. Is voting really voluntary? Now, I think there are situations in which voting can be voluntary. I talked about previous videos, friends choosing to go to a restaurant. And if two friends don't particularly like a restaurant, they are free to leave. They are free to go to other restaurants. They will not be forced, but they choose to follow along. They choose to acquiesce. So they consent, even though it's not their first choice. Okay, that's voluntary voting. That's fine. But if a result is going to be forced upon you simply because you are not in a majority, what are your options in terms of voting? Have you truly consented? People might be forced to vote to attempt to protect their liberties and rights. This is what I call voting in self-defense. They're not voting to get anything. They're not voting to win anything. They're not voting for services. They're not voting for, they're voting for avoidance of something happening against their rights and their liberties. Now, if someone found themselves in a war, all of a sudden there's fighting, breaks in, and someone must fight in order to survive out of self-defense. Okay, well, a person's not choosing to fight, they're having fighting forced upon them. And they're fighting for their mere survival. Could be the same situation with voting. People will have a certain result happen to them. The threat of force used against them. If a certain vote occurs, certain laws are made, whatever the case may be, that's going to affect them. So they may vote just for their own survival. If someone was in jail for whatever reason, but let's just say in this imaginary thought experiment, this person's in jail, but they allow them to vote on certain things in jail. What type of food would you like? Would it be nice? Now we're just asking, but would you vote for your freedom? Yeah, I would. Okay, well, thanks for voting, but what kind of food would you like? Well, I want mac and cheese. Okay, well, you're outnumbered, or you may get what you want, whatever the case may be. So they vote for these things. Does that mean that that person, because they've voted to be free, has consented to their imprisonment because they're participating in the system of voting? Is it really consent? If you don't vote, your taxes might be spent on something you disagree with. Therefore, you may be forced to vote. Right? If the money's going to be taken from you anyway to be spent on something, and you don't want it to be spent on X, but you do, and you don't want it to be spent at all, you don't want it to be taken from you, you don't want it to be spent on X, you may vote, okay, well, I guess I'll vote to put it in something that's less odious to me, less problematic to me. So they may vote just to make sure their money isn't spent on something that harms them, that they disagree with, that they hate, that's morally repugnant to them. If you don't vote, your rights and liberties might be at stake. Therefore, you're forced to vote. You have a very uncomplicated, in a sense, choice. Would you like to be master or slave? You can vote to be master or slave. You can vote in order to force others to do things by the outsourced force of government, or you can vote to avoid being enslaved by others. It all depends on if you vote and how much you have in terms of numbers. If you vote, you might become master, the ruler. But if you do not vote, you risk becoming a slave or the ruled. And so it's not a system in which we can really say, yes, this person has consented because they're voting? Well, voting may just be to avoid something bad happening to you. And it may be a fruitless effort, but it's an effort just to do the best you can. Is the secret ballot, as I mentioned earlier, is it a good thing? Neighbors can vote against the rights of their neighbors in secret. Outsource the force and the police power to this entity called government. But they don't really know that they're ruled by a secret government of people who voted in secret. Ballots or bullets. That the ballot here is going to turn into a bullet used for the enforcement of the law. So we have to think very carefully about what we say when we think of there should be a law for this or that. Because what that means is a law that will be enforced means it is okay to use force against human beings to make this happen or not happen. But in secret, people can vote for things that benefit, that enrich them at the expense of others. And they never know. And they don't feel bad because they're not the ones who have to hold a gun to the head of their neighbor or threaten them with imprisonment or threaten them with the death penalty for not following through. It's outsourced. And so these are some key things to consider in terms of voting and consent. Have we really consented? How would we know when someone really consents? And then there are categories of things like CPR or a doctor performing a life-saving surgery on someone who has fallen unconscious, in which you don't ask for consent. And so it can be a fine line, and it can be hard to tell sometimes exactly where it lies. But does legitimate government truly rest on consent? Or could it be something else that it rests on? And the consent of, really, according to Locke, being the consent of the majority, is that too flimsy? Or does he make a better argument than this critique portrays? So some things to think about there with regard to consent, but it is key because it goes back to using force against fellow human beings in order to accomplish certain political ends, and at what level that is morally, ethically acceptable.